This is a podcast about understanding counseling and how it works in everyday life. In this episode, we'll explore how responsibility and expectation quietly build over time and why they can start to feel emotionally costly, even when nothing obvious has changed. Responsibility often begins in very ordinary ways. You take something on because it needs doing. You step in because you're available. You follow through because you're reliable. None of this feels heavy at first. In fact, it often feels satisfying. Over time, though, responsibility tends to attract expectation. Responsibility tends to attract expectation. When something is handled well, it's remembered. When it's handled consistently, it becomes assumed. The expectation isn't always spoken, it shows up in subtle ways. People wait for you to decide. They look to you for reassurance. They pause until you respond. What makes this difficult is that expectation grows faster than the awareness of it. You may not notice how much is being expected of you until you feel tired, resentful, or stretched very thin. And by then, the pattern's already been established. This is why responsibility often feels heavier later rather than earlier. The task itself hasn't changed, but the emotional context around it has. What was once optional now feels required. What was once chosen now feels very automatic. You might recognize this at work. You become the person who handles certain situations well, so you're given more of them. Not formally, but informally. People trust you, so they rely on you. The workload might be manageable, but the expectation to always cope adds pressure. The same thing happens in families and relationships. You might become the organizer, the listener, the one who keeps things calm. Again, this often happens because you're capable. Not because you're asked, not because, someone requests it from you, just because you're capable. And over time, the role solidifies. What makes expectation emotionally costly is that it reduces flexibility. It narrows the range of responses that feel available. You may feel less able to say no, step back, or change pace without disappointing someone. Earlier in the series, we explored how environments and roles shape emotional experience. Expectation is one of the key mechanisms at work. When expectations are unclear or unspoken, the system stays alert. You're constantly checking whether you're meeting them. This check-in doesn't always register as stress. It often shows up as background tension, a sense of needing to stay on top of things, difficulty switching off, or a low level urgency that never quite settles. Another reason expectation becomes costly is that it's rarely renegotiated. Once people adapt to a certain level of responsibility from you, any change can feel disruptive. Even small adjustments can feel harder than taking the load itself. This is why people often continue carrying responsibility long after it's sustainable. Not because they want to, but because stepping out of expectation feels uncomfortable. Counseling helps people notice this by bringing attention to what has become assumed. When expectations are made visible, they become easier to think about rather than simply react to. Often, people realize that some expectations were never explicitly agreed to. They developed through repetition rather than intention. Recognizing that opens up new options. The goal here isn't to remove responsibility altogether. Responsibility can be meaningful and grounding. The shift comes from understanding where it's coming from and how it's being maintained. Over time, people often begin to separate what they genuinely want to carry from what they've been carrying by default. That distinction changes how responsibility feels. It becomes more deliberate and less draining. Understanding how responsibility and expectation builds up helps explain why people can feel worn down even when life looks stable. It reframes exhaustion as a response to sustained demand rather than a lack of resilience. In the next episode, we'll keep building on this by looking at how these patterns influence identity and self-perception, and why people can start defining themselves around what they carry rather than who they are.